I'm joined now by Zerlina Maxwell, Assistant Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and co-founder of A Long Walk Home, and Zerlina Maxwell, political analyst and contributor to thegrio.com. You know, Zerlina, I want to pick up with the story here because some social analysts have been concerned about the fact that when violence is precipitated, nobody wants to see the violence. It certainly has to be maintained, calm has to be restored, but how unbalanced it is to focus on that aspect of it as opposed to what caused the violence to begin in the first place. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a slight misdirection. And, you know, you wrote that wonderful book on Katrina. That's the last time we've most recently heard about people rioting in response to a failed crisis, both in terms of, you know, natural disaster, but also the failed governmental response. And for me, you know, one of the most radicalizing moments for my generation, obviously, was Rodney King, the verdict, and obviously the subsequent rebellion that took place in L.A. Right. So I think when we talk about rioting and looting, the question is, when is it appropriate to have civil unrest? When is it appropriate for communities to defend themselves? And when is it appropriate for communities to organize, both in terms of peaceful protests, but also, you know, what are the stakes and what does it take for communities of color, particularly African American, working class communities, to have a justified and sense of justice in their communities? Does it take these kind of responses? It takes this violence and the murder of a young African American boy then to lead to an organized response on the part of public officials, but also, you know, the rioting and the looting, I think, are just code words and names for civil unrest. And I don't know what the appropriate response is to the epidemic of black young people being killed, both by private citizens and by police officers, almost, you know, monthly, if not, you know, weekly at this point.
Yeah, every 28 hours we know that some young black person is being gunned down on the streets of America, but especially at the hands of state representatives in terms of police departments and others. Zerlina, the social media network has been very intense in responding to this and other catastrophes, crises, and chaos. Tell us about the hashtag "If They Gun Me," you know, what is it? If they gun me down.
Well,
Tell us about that.
That's a response, and I think a really, really poignant message talking about the problem of respectability politics, which is when a young black person or a person of color is gunned down or killed, often the picture that is portrayed in the media is trying to put them in a box like they tried to make Trayvon Martin into a thug by showing pictures of him that some of which were not even him, but of him in a wife beater, sort of in stereotypical positions, or you know, on the other hand, being someone who is educated like Michael Brown starting school on Monday. Are they showing the picture of him sort of in the jersey with his hands up, or are they showing his high school graduation picture? And I think that the response by the media when it is a white person who is killed early on in their life versus a black person, the response could not be more different. Their humanity is always, even when it's a school shooter, largely the media is trying to find why did they do this, you know, what went wrong, and I think that they're thought of as someone who has the full range of humanity, and that is not something that is given to young black people who are gunned down, unfortunately.
I want to pick up on that because I was at an eatery recently in Washington, D.C., and I saw a young white kid cursing the police out. And I was fearful, and I said, oh, no, he's a white guy. He's going to be all right. And he was. They talked to him. They didn't beat him. They didn't reprimand him. They dismissed it because they understood he was a young person who was irate or perhaps even a bit drunk. So, Zerlina, there have been several studies that talk about the dehumanization of black kids. Black boys in particular in terms of not being seen as innocent. Black girls and boys not seen as fully human. How do we then balance the reality that there's a pervasive belief in the society that deprives young black people of their humanity, and at the same time talk about the outrage that evokes when an incident like this occurs?
Well, again, I want to just pick up what you were talking about with the hashtag, because that's a response to the criminalization of black people, right? And then the rhetoric of looting and rioting is also a kind of recriminalization of black people. So you have both a response to this young African-American man, Michael Brown, that in some ways assumes that blackness is always a threat. He's already a criminal, therefore he's worthy of being killed by a police officer. And then you have the rhetoric about African-American civil unrest being further criminalization. And so there are not just conundrums, but I think there's an irony in many, a devastating irony, the fact that black people are always perceived as criminals, and that younger and younger African Americans are seen, you know, the studies show that 4-year-olds are being kicked out of classes, boys and girls, African American boys and girls, for unruly behavior. So there's actually very little protection of black childhood, and there's an earlier and earlier criminalization of black children. And so therefore, the outcome here of Michael Brown, his tragic death, is in many ways part of the system of criminalization of black people, but also the ways in which black lives are seen as unworthy, seen as less than, and seen as easy, the outcome will be black death.
Right. Well, picking up on that, Ferguson's population is nearly 70%. Would there be this kind of outrage if the situation were reversed? What about if a black policeman had shot a white kid? What do you think the outcome then? Given what you've both given to us in analytical precision, what would the outcome be then?
Well, I think certainly there would be outrage in the community, the white community in St. Louis, but I also think that if a young white person were gunned down, I think the black community as well would be outraged. I think, we are sick and tired of seeing it be our sons and our daughters, but I think that we value life, and so I think that the sense of justice isn't something that is, we only care about black life, even though, as she said, it's valued as less than. But also I think about Cliven Bundy, and I think about, all of his supporters showing up with guns faced at the federal officials, and they were able to stay there, and it was a standoff. It wasn't, they didn't come in with tanks and start tear gassing people on their own front yards. And so I just think that if it were a white life lost, I think that there would be predictable outrage, but certainly the response here is inappropriate. And, I think back to the Dred Scott decision when I think about this case, and I think about the rhetoric in that when they were talking about how blacks have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And I think that, we have to come beyond 1857.
No doubt about that. Salamisha, when we talk about this, how do we get our leaders, who understandably are calling for peace and calm, to understand the complicated terrain that you've spoken to, so that they don't end up reproducing the pathology of blackness and seeing these young black people as already criminalized and participating in the further criminalization of them by calling for peace without having that complicated understanding of that history involved?
Well, I mean, I guess the call for peace is understandable, but the call for justice is much more dire. And so I think when we're speaking of our leaders, I think there's a variety. There are elected officials, there are civil rights leaders, there are everyday citizens, that the ongoing desire for racial justice and full equality for African Americans is the end goal. So you can have a rhetoric of peace in the community and saying that you don't want these communities to be further devastated. But I think the real issue is, when you have these police officers in these communities, both on a day-to-day basis and here with riot gear to fend off potential citizens, I mean, who are we seeing as the perpetrators of violence, right? And in this case, obviously, it was a white police officer, and you have police officers there not to protect the citizens, but to fend off rioters. So I think, for me, the issue is, I go back to when you have, military presence in Eisenhower and desegregation, and the ways in which the federal government, understanding the ways that local governments may not be able to protect their citizens because they're already rife with racism, that there is a call for perhaps federal intervention to help protect black citizens who are under siege, whether it's New York City, whether it's St. Louis, whether it's Florida or California. I mean, it's happening so much. So I think we deserve more, and we should be asking for more as well.
Well, should we be asking more from the President of the United States of America? He made a statement, right, in terms of the heartbrokenness that he and Michelle Obama felt, but is that putting him as a political outsider, or should he be circumspect at this point until more facts are in, or should he perhaps issue an edict to the federal government to perhaps protect the people in that particular locale more vigorously?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. There's a pattern here. I mean, as Barack Obama has been president of the United States for the last, his 2 terms, there have been a succession of black people have been killed both by private citizens and by police officers. And so the moral courage and the moral conscience of the president, I believe, would be to help protect citizens at all costs. And, there is that rhetoric that he uses of self-defense, of people having the right to defend themselves against other attacks, whether it's in Israel, and that's the language he uses there. I think here we should think about African Americans as citizens who are under siege and under attack as well.
All right. Salamisha Tillett and Zerlina Maxwell, thank you so much for your time tonight.